Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch. Sorry, it's me again. Can't get rid of me. So I wrote a recent Lloyd's List report saying that there was a disparity between what the industry is saying and what they're doing. And we're going to hear this week about all these laudable efforts from many companies and programs, and they're all promising net zero, and they're aligning themselves with Paris Agreement goals of keeping 1.5 alive, and all of these good things. But a fraction of them have actually committed to solid science-based targets to action those promises. We did a quick totting up with the help of some friends. I won't reveal who helped us, because she's probably not going to like it, but we added up the amount of people that are in the various programs, Sea Cargo Charter, GMF, Race to Zero, various others. If you take the rough universe of companies that are purporting to be aligned with 1.5, you're looking at a maritime sector industry collective of around 350, 400 companies. Anyone want to take a guess as to how many of those companies actually have science-based targets initiatives against those promises? I'll tell you, I counted. There's 11. So I would say there is a gap between our rhetoric and reality here. A more cynical journalist, not me, you understand, but a more cynical journalist might suggest that the green corridors that we've been hearing so much about are, to date, a paper exercise. Dual fuel capability is, as we heard this morning, still essentially a hedge bet on the part of the owners. As we discussed, you've got a vessel that's theoretically capable of burning sustainable fuel, but it's not going to generate any value until we actually see those fuels come into the market, and we've got a mechanism to bridge the gap in terms of those prices. Look, I accept it. That all sounds like the words of an overly cynical journalist whose take on what is essentially a very complex and, I agree, nuanced series of industrial political transitions. Then I am opening the debate here and wanting our panel to challenge me. I want a more accurate view of where we are right now and what it's actually going to take to catalyze and shorten the gap between that rhetoric and reality. On our panel today, we have representatives from the key areas of the industry that are able to actually push this forward. A regulator, a financier, a class executive, a charterer, and a shipowner's representative walk into a conference center sounds like the beginning to a bad joke, but I say it is ultimately very serious what these people are able to push us towards. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Mr. Jan Ole Huseby, Global Head of Ocean Industries at DNV. He's the financier. Knut Ørbeck-Nilssen, you should be familiar with him by now, he's been on stage. He is the class. Fotini Ioannidou, Head of the Unit for Directorate-General of Mobility and Transport, it's a very long business card, the regulator. Rasmus Nielsen, obviously from Trafigura, Head of Fuel Decarbonization, but also Chairman of the Sea Cargo Charter as well. And Harald Solberg, Chief Executive Officer of the Norwegian Shipowners Association. Welcome to you all. Rasmus, I'm afraid I'm going to come to you first, as I tend to. I started off with the skeptic's introduction, because I read your report, the Trafigura report, about what is possible. The white paper, essentially, for those of you who haven't read it, basically said that green e-fuels produced from renewable energy could be produced in abundance from the developing countries in the global south. Now, it came with a fairly major caveat, didn't it? Unlocking the potential in developing world, in the world to produce these fuels is going to require the IMO to set a global carbon price, and that is a pretty big caveat from where we are now. So, is that what we're waiting for? Are we waiting for regulatory clarity before we can move? How optimistic are you that we're going to get that regulatory clarity? Kick us off.
Thank you, Richard. I'm actually super happy to sit here today because there's so much going on, and compared to last year in April when we sat here, it was a lot less clear 14 months ago what will happen. And excuse me for spending 4 minutes, but it's quite important for me to tell you the full story of what's going on and why we do need IMO and regulation. In Europe, 7 months ago, there was national elections in Denmark. There was no talks about hydrogen infrastructure. 4 weeks ago, the German energy minister, the Danish energy minister, they signed an agreement for hydrogen pipelines connection in 2028. what German minister said, he said, we can take all the hydrogen that Denmark produces. And by the way, it's going to be a lot. Okay. So the industrial Europe is very, very likely to take all the hydrogen it produces itself. Okay. So here we have a potential decoupling of the global south, which is sort of the countries in Africa, South America, etc. If they don't get to produce green shipping fuels, then they will be left behind on technology and evolution on society. So the unlocking part is to make green fuels production competitive in the global south. The privilege that the global south has is that they can produce hydrogen half the price of what we can in Europe. In the global south, it's looking to be about 2 to 3 euros per kilogram, where in Europe, as per current electricity prices, it's twice the price. And we know from our industry that we can actually successfully transport commodities around the world. So the commodities that the global south can produce has a real chance to come around the world and to be competitively sold into the shipping world. But the challenge that the global south has, they're not as far as the European and Western hemisphere in terms of building up infrastructure because they don't have the industries that can pay for it. So what we see, and in Trafigura we have an investment into a company called H2 Energy, and we're trying to build a 1 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity in Esbjerg, which is €1 billion plus capacity, or investment, sorry. Next to us we have Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which is Europe's and soon the world's largest energy infrastructure investment fund. They're today managing 20 billion. I'm confident they're going to be managing the biggest fund in 5 years. What they have as a strategy recently was to create and produce ammonia in Denmark for shipping and for agricultural industry. But recently, they are sort of starting to turn that dialogue into a hydrogen dialogue. So what that means is that Europe is looking not to be competitive on the production of green fuels, but on hydrogen. And herein lies the key. And I'm just off the UN Global Compact meeting with Kita Glim. And actually, the opportunity for the Global South and the responsibility for IMO is we need a significant carbon pricing so you can give the Global South to come on the technology path. One more comment, sorry, and I know time is running. Last week we had an energy minister from Germany visiting, regional energy minister with a business delegation. And technology question to top, so where's your next factory going to be? And they're producing electrolyzers. They said, of course, the US. And of course, all these investments, they're going to be made in the West because the Western countries can afford it. And then it's going to leave the Global South behind. So for me, and I'm sitting here with a lot of confidence speaking because I feel it, I sense it, and we see it from an investment perspective, that if the global pricing is not there, it will not happen. And the IMO, I believe, is waking up. So I'm actually sitting here sort of more relaxed than I've been for a long time because I think it's going to happen. Thank you.
Now you see why I had to come to him first, because otherwise we run out of time. Knut, another report I read recently, the one that the IMO Secretariat commissioned, DNV Ricardo report, again, similarly produced a very optimistic view of the theoretical and what could be possible above and beyond business as usual. But again, it had the caveat that we require clear demand signals and we require regulatory clarity. Give us your view. I mean, is that now the key blocker? And I apologize in advance to Fotini, who's coming as the punchline to all of this, but is it regulation that is the key to getting this right?
It's important, but I don't think it's the only thing. And I think we all realize that this is quite a complex thing to drive, and it will require a lot of different initiatives. Regulation will play an important role, and I'm sure carbon pricing or the EU ETS will help drive this. There's no doubt about that. But there is, say, the fundamental question that also Rasmus brought up, and that is many of these better fuels, they will be late and in short supply. And the reason for that is that it takes a lot of investments, whether it's in the south or in the Western world, to build out the renewable energy sources, to have the infrastructures in the places where ships need that to be, and not least also, which is largely underspoken, is the need for the seafarers to be trained, because after all, it doesn't help if we are able to put new technologies, new fuels on board, unless the seafarers are capable of handling it. And another report that we made, and I'm sorry for sort of dumping yet another report, but our estimates is that we will talk about the range of 300,000 to 750,000 seafarers needing training just to manage these changes by 2050. Now, the good news is that since the new fuels will be late, we still have some time. But it is important that we get started because, after all, we cannot compromise anything on safety.
We are definitely going to come back to the safety issue before we finish this panel, but I want to stick on the regulation theme for a moment and turn to Fotini, who we're very lucky to have here. Just as Knut is representing all of class, Fotini, unfortunately, is representing the whole of regulation, so apologies. But we heard from Kitak Lim, Secretary-General of the IMO, earlier this morning, and he seems on optimistic form that we can enter into MEPC 80 and raise the ambition of the IMO. He also seems reasonably optimistic that there could ultimately be a convergence of global and European regulation, because at the moment we have the Fit for 55 package, we have the European trading system coming in, we have many measures, and one of the concerns, I guess, of the industry has been this divergence of regional regulation versus global regulation, and we're at a sort of fairly crucial point. So start us off by giving the overview in terms of where we are in Europe, because I think it's really important that we understand that right now.
Thank you, Richard. Very pleased also to be with you today. Indeed, we are in Europe, we are very close to have a fully fledged regulatory framework. But let me start by explaining the rationale, why we rushed. And this is because also we have been received of a lot of criticism by putting in place a regional system. The context, first of all, was the commitment that the European Union has taken in the context of the Green Deal to become a carbon neutral economy by 2050. In this context, each sector had to contribute its part, and shipping is no exception to it, and that's why we have put in place the so-called Fit for 55 legislative framework. Now, this framework is composed of several interlinked proposals. So the first one is the inclusion of shipping in the emission trading scheme. This legislation has been adopted and will enter into force already for January 2024, so next year. The second element, and this will put a price on carbon. The second element, the second legislation that is very important as well is the FuelEU Maritime, which sets a clear roadmap on how we will reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of the energy produced on board. And this regulation is addressing the demand side and is there to give a clear signal to incentivize investments in the industry, but also in the fuel supply industry. And then we have also a legislation that covers infrastructure. So all elements are covered, and I should also mention the supply side with the revision of our Renewable Energy Directive. Because shipping, I mean, decarbonizing shipping is so complex, we needed to address all these factors. So FuelEU and the infrastructure regulation are going to be adopted by the end of the year, but we have basically finished the content of what this means, and they will enter into force 1st January 2025. So we are very close in having a proper legislative framework. What all this legislation will do, they will give a clear price signal to incentivize investments. They offer predictability to all the actors in order to plan these investments, and they will help close the price gap between fossil fuels and clean fuels. And there is a lot of work ongoing now in order to define all the implementation details in what we call secondary legislation with the experts. So that's where we are in terms of the EU legislative framework, close to have it ready. But now I would like to come back to the essence of your question about the convergence. The fact that the EU has gone ahead doesn't mean that the regulation shouldn't be global. On the contrary, and that's what I was very pleased to hear Secretary-General to recognize, that the fact that we have pushed ahead did help IMO. And we, as EU, we are very much committed to have a global regulation. We are doing everything we can to help IMO with our experience, because all this legislation required very careful drafting, a lot of negotiation. So we have clear details on what needs and what should not be done. And so we are really helping IMO in preparing this crucial committee that is MEPC. From our perspective, this historical committee, IMO needs to deliver a revised strategy with a high level of ambition to decarbonize shipping by mid-century, and to select the measures in order to put this into reality. And there as well, coherent in the way we have done in the EU legislation, we are proposing a combination of a technical measure like the Fuel EU and an economic measure. And I couldn't agree more that an economic measure is also a must in order to finance this difficult transition, but also to get developing countries on board. So the most important thing, I left it for the end, is that all our legislation contains review clauses that say when the IMO adopts such measures, we are going to reassess, so that at the end we will be able to converge and have the global standard.
I'm going to push at the edge of what I'm allowed to ask here, Fotini, but can you give us any flavor in terms of what the EU is going to be pushing for inside MEPC, and any idea in terms of the potential timings of what that convergence might look like? Because realistically, I think most people in the room who follow the IMO and understand what is going on will accept that we're going to have some degree of net zero come out of MEPC 80. The difficult stuff is still yet to come. It will come after MEPC 80. There's various tracks of work inside. We're not going to get much more than the ambition statement coming out in July. What needs to happen, to your mind, for us to see that convergence down the line between what the IMO is doing and what the EU is doing, and how quickly could we see that theoretically?
Let me first start by saying what the EU is pushing as position at MEPC. Indeed, we are pushing for a revised high level of ambition. We are pushing for phasing out emissions from shipping by 2050, but we are also pushing for a clear decarbonization trajectory with milestones, which will allow to give this signal of certainty that everybody needs at the end for the global south, or whomever wants to produce clean fuels, and also that will drive the design of measures. We are also pushing for a target to have energy clean fuels by already 2030, used by shipping. In terms of the measures, and that is super important for us, because without measures, any level of ambition is not, is not going to materialize. What we would like to see is a selection of measures in July, so together with the strategy. And as I said, we are pushing for a technical measure and GHG fuel standard similar to our fuel EU standard. We are pushing also for an economic measure in the form of a levy. And for us, it is equally important that in July, MEPC decides on the measures to be selected, because we will need another 2 years in order to agree on the design of these measures, because we will need also to take into account, to do analysis to avoid disproportionate negative consequences for countries. And our aim would be, and that's what we have put on the table for IMO, that these are adopted by 2025 and enter into force by 2027. Well, if we are able to do that, we will be able to really start kicking off the real transition well before 2030, and that would be the moment when we are going, on the EU side, look again at our legislation and do the necessary adjustments.
Okay. I apologize for going quite so far into the weeds, but I think it's important context here because it colors the rest of the debate. We've often said that, the IMO is often misrepresented, in my view, as being, glacial in its pace. The IMO is nothing more than the collective will of 176 member state governments, just as the EU is nothing more than the collective will of, it's 27, I now no longer remember. And there are subtle differences even between the Environment Directorate and the Transport Directorate, and at a national level between the Transport Minister's view and the Environment Minister's view. So there is a huge amount of complexity here in those politics, but ultimately it leads up into this question of, can we get some clarity as an industry? Can we move ahead? So, Harald, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, I asked the same question in the previous panel about this sort of gap between rhetoric and reality, but do you get the impression that ship owners are still waiting to move ahead? Are we using it as, not necessarily as a pretext for inaction, but is there a blocker in us actually moving ahead as an industry from a ship owner's point of view?
Not from my point of view, and to disagree a little bit with your quite negative intro, I think if we rewind the discussion in our industry 5 to 7 years back, I think there was a quite common understanding that the shipping industry, we are carbon captive. There is no alternatives for our ships, so we need to continue fuel our ships by carbon fuel. Now, when we look at the discussion within our industry, all segments search for decarbonized alternatives, for alternative fuels. We don't know the result yet, because this is up to the market, but the energy and the ambition and the push from the industry itself has changed dramatically over these 5 to 7 years. So I'm quite optimistic, actually. And with the Norwegian Shipowners Association, we have put forward quite ambitious strategy. We aim to be climate neutral by 2050 and only order ships based on zero emission technology from 2030. But that doesn't mean that these ships will run on zero emission technology. That is up to the market. So we need to put the right regulations in place. So we are calling upon IMO to take the leadership, because we, as an international industry, we need international regulations. We fear a patchwork of regional schemes all around the world. So we call upon IMO to take leadership, put the price on carbon, use these proceeds or the money collected from a price on carbon to finance the energy transition. Then the energy transition will be paid for by the industry itself. So I think this is manageable. IMO has done it previously. For instance, on oil and oil spill, new regulations from the IMO has been very important to drive the development of our industry. So we can do it again. And in this aspect, I think that the EU pushes IMO, and I think that is good. And from our part and from the European shipowners' part, we have been constructive in the dialogue with the European Union to establish the EU ETS as workable as possible. But our primary goal is to have this scheme established on an international level. That's what the industry needs.
Thank you. Ioannidou, just as I'm not necessarily holding these guys responsible for their pillars. I'm not holding you responsible for the whole of the finance industry. But I mean, give us the general view, because you're members of the Poseidon Principles. You're pushing ahead. you're trying to make this a more transparent process. But what do you make of this gap between rhetoric and reality, in your view? Because you have said there is that gap.
Yeah, there is a gap, and I think it's very encouraging to hear what the EU is about to do and how that can affect also IMO, etc., etc. But I think there are so many pieces that needs to come together. So one thing is when you get the legislation, and then people will run for the yards, to build ships, new ships with new engines. You will have retrofits. Then you need to make all of this fuel. There will be a lot of supply chain finances. So I think everyone needs also to be very aware of it's in fact a transition in all parts of the value chain, because it cannot happen all at the same time. I think there's, you know, the gap is, we have to be ambitious and we have to move fast and all of that, but it needs also to be realistic, right? So I think that is one of the concerns that we have to be aware of. I think that's where we see the gap, at least. So ambitious, definitely, but also it needs to be realistic.
The consequences of not getting this right are, and I think you picked up on this, Rasmus, in the report, is, you know, increasing national regulations, increasing favouring towards things like the IRA we heard about earlier, you know, which arguably is a protectionist move. You know, we don't have that global transition, and the key part of the discussion that we're having at the supranational level is that equitable transition. And if we don't have something approaching a global move, that's what we risk. Do you think the industry has clocked both the commercial and political consequences of not moving fast enough? Because we talk about this like it's our decision, it's an ambition that we aspire to, but there are real consequences to not getting this right, aren't there?
You're asking me?
I am,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's two separate things, because the ship owner is historically probably not coming from the middle of Africa.
No.
So I don't think the ship owners see that responsibility, and I'm not blaming anyone. But we have to understand that the key for the Global South sits in the shipping industry being able to offtake these green fuels or low emission fuels. So it comes together, but each of them don't understand that. So I think, yeah. But again, without making it feasible for competitively priced fuels, we will not have the shipping industry being able to offload this for the Global South.
Knut, that idea of not moving fast enough and the commercial consequences of not moving fast enough, tiered industry we talked about this morning, the risk of stranded assets, an unequitable transition. Have those realities sunk in, do you think, in the conversation? Are we having a more mature, informed conversation, this North shipping, than the ones we had a couple of years ago, do you think?
Yeah, but again, it's and I actually didn't reply to your question from both. Sorry for that. It's the countries who will benefit, and the countries who have realized this, and this amongst others the US, and they've made a masterpiece of a policy. And I think there's a reason why the US dollar is strong and why it will continue to get stronger, because they've invested in the future. You see Norway, and again I'm not blaming, but Norwegian currency is not very strong. And how much offshore wind have Norway put money into recent years? It's probably very little. And again, I'm not a currency expert, but it's just extremely interesting to understand how the US currency has strengthened itself. And I think a lot of people are realizing a ton of technology, a ton of jobs is right now going to the US. So it's not so much about the individual ship owner, but it's about the countries in the West which have seen the financial benefits of being a first mover on this green transition, whether it's shipping or something else. And I come with a different example. We have hydrogen trucks in Switzerland, and a hydrogen infrastructure through H2 Energy, and that's the company wanting to build hydrogen in Denmark. In Denmark, there's a problem on the total cost of ownership for for trucks, and the comparison is diesel. Today, again, hydrogen costs 10 euro per kilograms. In the future, it's going to cost 5, maybe less, as more and more green electricity gets built in the North Sea. Because we get this large-scale hydrogen production, it suddenly means that hydrogen trucks can hit the roads in scale. And that's down to the countries actually getting a lot of separate benefits from production of green fuels. So it's really on a much, much higher political level than we've seen ever in the past. And the US right now is completely mastering it, and it's totally amazing and fantastic because it's pushing the rest of the world. One more comment, infrastructure. We need certainty to have a lot of fuels available because that's what's going to justify building infrastructure. And here we have, again, we need 30 million tons approximately of methanol ammonia if it's going to be 5% zero emission fuels by 2030. But the problem is we're not going to have the tankage infrastructure and we're going to have to invest into it. But what is the commodity that we're going to have to build for? And we need to turn the tanks. That's how it works when you're investing significantly. And again, right now, the Western world will have the benefit because they have these policies that can subsidize the production of green fuels. And by the way, right now we see 20 to 25 million tons of blue ammonia coming out of the US in 5 to 7 years. And I only think it's going to get further emphasis. You see John Kerry, he's coming tomorrow. I think he realized what the US can benefit from shipping decarbonizing. And it's absolutely cool and amazing that the US is pushing forward. But now we just need the opportunity for the rest of the world so we don't get a two-tier transition where the global south is left further behind than they are today. And that's not so much down to the individual ship owner. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Knut.
It's difficult to remember what your question was, but I think it was...
I've forgotten as well.
Have we progressed since North Shipping last time?
Is it a more mature conversation?
And I think you used the phrase glacier speed, right?
Yeah.
Indicating it's very slow.
Yes.
But I can tell you, glacier speed is way too fast, actually. It's melting like nothing else. So I think we moved quite rapidly since last time. And I think everyone, at least here in the audience, but also globally, they realize that we have to decarbonize. So it's not a question of if, but it's a question of how. Now, there are real challenges, and we tend to talk about shipping as one community, right? Mm-hmm. And it is a lot of different trades, vessels, routes, etc., etc. And it will not be as easy for everyone. But what I think we have seen a lot of is that some that have the opportunity are taking real tangible steps. And there are still many that find it very difficult to make a decision on a new build, what to choose. And here I think we are doing ourselves no good by saying that we belong to this camp or that camp, and everyone using LNG as fuel is totally off, or LPG is totally off, or ammonia, or methanol, or whatever. I think there's a lot that we can do to realize that there's going to be so many different solutions for so many different ship owners and trades and vessel types. So let's stop talking each other down and rather help, promote the steps that we can take. And I've said many times, LPG as a fuel, at least 15% CO2 improvement. LNG, maybe 25%. Methanol, of course, it's great if you can run on green methanol, but many can't. And then it's even worse off than what we have today. Mm. But there's so much that we can do also on energy efficiency measures, and that, I think, is largely under-communicated. And, finally, on digitalization to make things be more efficient throughout the logistic chains. There is a huge potential. So, we have moved quite far, and the glaciers are melting way too fast.
Harald.
Yeah, I just want to bring in an example from Norway. We have the example from our ferry sector. If you go 10 years back, this was a sector which had a lot of old fossil-driven ships, and nobody thought that the Norwegian ferry sector would be the spearheader of new technology worldwide. Then the Norwegian Parliament decided that all new tenders within the ferry sector should be based on zero-emission technology. The Parliament, they didn't took any position on what kind of technology. The only requirement was zero-emission technology. And there was a competition in the market which led to a win for the electric-driven ferries. And the total fleet of Norwegian ferries counts to around 200 ships. and we now have 80 battery-driven or electric ships, and there is no technology hindrance anymore to decarbonize the rest of the fleet. It's only a question on when the contracts expire, and when you enter into new contracts, then you will have decarbonized the whole fleet of 200 ships. So I think when these measures are done in the right way, and there is technology available, this process can happen very fast. This has happened on a timeline less than 10 years. So I think when we have the right incentives, when we have the right goals, and when we have the right regulations, this can happen very fast.
Okay. Yeah, no.
And I just want to add to that, Harald, because what I also found very encouraging about that example is how when you created these incentives and this demand, really, it spiked cooperation across the industry throughout the value chain. So you actually had everyone from the ferry operator to the yard and everything in between working almost seamlessly together, making that happen. So I think that's also a very important point there.
And before I getting arrested from the audience here, I am totally aware that batteries will not be the solution for the deep sea shipping. I completely agree. And so that's not part of the discussion, but this was an example on how this transition can happen very fast when we have technology available.
Understood. Fotini.
Yes, if I may add on the question of which fuels, and I fully agree with Knut there, that there will be very different solutions, very different fuels for different type of ships and trades. From our perspective, that is why we have taken, as a regulator, a technology-neutral approach. But there is one element that is very important, is on which basis we assess the performance of these technologies. And in the EU legislative framework, we have taken a well-to-wake approach, and we are also promoting this approach and working hard in IMO to have the same approach, because this is the only way that we have a fair comparison among fuels, and that we avoid having stranded assets. So this is also a regulatory clarity that is very important, and we hope in July we have the adoption of these guidelines on the life cycle approach.
With 3 minutes to go, I'm not getting sucked into a well-to-wake debate. We do not have time. But I would like to ask you the same question I asked to, are we having a more mature conversation? And I wonder, are you sensing a shift in the conversation that you're having both with industry but also with other governments? And you know, the point that is made there about the IRA in the US and the shifts that are happening not just inside the IMO but nationally. Do you feel that the debate has now finally moved on and we are having a properly informed discussion at the level that you're discussing?
Yes, we are quite positive in the way the discussions have evolved, also within this industry. And I mean, I wouldn't be as pessimistic as you were in the beginning. So we see a real shift in the mindset. Also in the industry, we see big moves from, of course, they are easier for the bigger companies, less easy for the smaller companies. But I mean, everything is going in the right direction, but now what we need is the regulatory framework at international level. This will not be enough to come to one of your questions. We need clearly more collaboration. This industry needs to go out and discuss, set contracts with fuel suppliers, and in the EU, we are setting up such a structure in order to ramp up the production of fuels, but of clean fuels. But we do see a change in the mindset, and I think that this will be really, if we have a good deal in July, we will be able really to kick off this transition. On the financing, that indeed remains an issue. We need to make sure that the frameworks we have will facilitate this transition. And on our side, as EU, is the next question we are looking at in order to see what products do we have in place, and how the demand and the supply will match, also bearing in mind the difficulty of the smaller players to be in this transition. So I'm on a positive note, but clearly with 1 month before us, there is a lot to be done before we have a deal.
Well, likewise, we don't have time for Wales Awake, but we don't have time for the EU taxonomy. That is another conference, but we will get to that at some point. And for the record, I am actually, reasonably optimistic and positive. I'm contractually obliged to put on the facade of a cynical old hack for standing up here. I'm going to finish with one question and take moderator's prerogative to go slightly over time, because we do need to do the safety question. And I wanted to leave it last because I wanted it in everybody's mind as we go into the next panel. This one is for you. How do we ensure that that balance between decarbonisation and safety is now front and centre in everything we do? Because to my mind, we have not had it at the focal point of the debate, and it's changing, but it's not changing quickly enough to my mind.
Yeah, and I think the first thing would be to say that it's not a balance. It has to be safety, first and foremost. And then, of course, we have to adapt to the situation, to the fuels, to the technologies, etc. And that is, in my view, such a real hurdle that we need to get across together. And we can only imagine having, say, a bad accident with a new fuel type, new technologies, how that is going to set us back. So, and when it comes to the safety issue, there are two things that I think is really important. I mentioned one already, that's the training of the seafarers in particular, but also for the onshore personnel. The other thing that is so important is that we need pilots. We need pilots where we can control the environment. It's like a laboratory. So we can do the pilots in a controlled environment, making sure that we gain experience, that we do it in a safe manner, that we can update rules and regulations and training curriculums, etc. So more pilots, and that's where I have high ambitions for the green corridors, because obviously between two nation states, two different ports, that could be more easily facilitated than trying to launch something globally or regionally.
Wonderful. We are slightly over time. Apologies, Nicholas. But a big thank you, to Capital Link, who I forgot to mention in the first panel. So thank you for Capital Link putting on such a marvellous show today. And thank you to our panel today. A round of applause for the panel here.